Welcome everyone to the March 10th City Council work session. Welcome to everyone here and everyone at home. You can see who's around the table, and on the phone we have Councilor Evans, and is Councilor Taylor there too?
Yes, I'm here.
So Councilor Taylor and Councilor Evans are on the phone to join us. And the first item we're going to be addressing this evening, which is sitting at your place, is the voters pamphlet.
Right.
Want to put a motion out there?
Yeah, I will. I move to waive the requirement for the city to produce a voter's pamphlet for the May 20, 2014 primary election.
Second.
Moved and seconded. And I think the comment that I would make is I think everybody around the table has been talked to about this that's running for office, and nobody has any opposition, so it didn't seem like a worthwhile expenditure of money to put out a voter's pamphlet. So that's it, and I'll let you all, George, you want to speak to that?
Well, I just would like to add, Madam Mayor, that in addition to the fact that the four councilors, as well as the EWEB commissioners that are for re-election, do not have opponents, there's also no city measure
That's correct.
on the ballot, and we're not required at that point, or we can waive the voter's pamphlet in that case. Had there been a city measure on the ballot, then we would be producing one of the city voter
Absolutely.
pamphlets.
Thank you for that. All right, further discussion on this topic? Councilor Evans, Councilor Taylor?
No.
Okay, we'll be ready to vote then. All those in favor, please indicate. 5 around the table. Councilor Evans?
Aye.
Aye. Councilor Taylor?
Aye.
Okay, so that's 7 in favor and none in opposition. It passes. The next item up this evening is a motion by Councilor Pryor.
Yeah, I realize that we have a lot to do this evening, so I will hopefully make this as quick as possible. I'll put out the motion, and then I'll ask for a second. If I get it, then I can speak to it briefly. I have made a couple of modifications to the motion, and I'll explain what those are based on events that have occurred today. I move to approve a rest stop under the city's rest stop ordinance at the approximate location of the existing car camp on city-owned land near Autzen Stadium. The rest stop shall be limited to no more than 15 individuals in addition to those currently at the car camp. First preference for the rest of the 15 spots shall be people who are now sleeping at the Broadway Hilliard site who have physical disabilities or a mental illness. The rest stop operating agreements will include provisions to ensure minimum disruptions to surrounding facilities and events. I added that.
All right. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Discussion? You want to go first?
Yeah, I'll just speak to it briefly. Part of the reason I brought this up is that or why I modified it or brought it up today, is that I have learned today, I don't have this on absolutely reliable, but I have learned today that the folks who had indicated they would provide the operation for rest stop number 3 that we designated have indicated that they will not operate rest stop number 3 if it is located directly next to rest stop number 2. They believe that's concentrating too many people in one place, which means if that is indeed true, and then we no longer have a viable rest stop number 3, which puts me in the position of figuring what can we do to try to accommodate the people that are going to be displaced from Whoville. Whoville will close, and we need to take care of those displaced people. In looking at different locations, I have visited some, and I believe that a spot where an existing car camp is near Autzen Stadium is a viable location to place what were the rest stop number 3 folks, at least temporarily, until we can come up with a more viable solution. I'm not intending this to be a permanent rest stop location. It's where I can get the Whoville folks temporarily until we can continue to work on a more permanent solution. That's why I went from in addition to full 15, because if we're not going to have a site number 3, I got to try to accommodate as many people as possible. We're talking probably about a difference of about 5 folks. I also recognize that this location, even though it currently is a car camp, is close to the walking path that goes to Cuthbert, and is also, there's some distance away from the Science Factory and also Autzen Stadium. Those are all surrounding facilities, and events go on there, so I want to make sure that we have a viable additional solution or continuing solution that will try to reduce disruptions for those as much as we possibly can. But this is, I think, a temporary measure to get Whoville successfully closed, get the people to a location, and then we can continue to work on further movement, meaning looking for the partnership, looking for the big solution that we can do more than just the token things we're doing right now, which I acknowledge are token.
So I have Mike Clark, George Brown, and George Polling in the queue, and I want to ask Councilor Evans and Councilor Taylor, do you want to be in the queue?
Not at this time, Mayor.
Okay.
No, not yet.
All right. So, Councilor Clark.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate that Chris has efforted to try and ease the closing of the illegal camping that's going on at the corner there downtown. But I have some concerns with this location. I've had some friends and people call me who do a lot of work with the city. Chief, and the reason I'll probably vote against it is because it's unclear to me exactly how it'll work and where it'll work. When I hear the parking area there, one of my chief concerns is we have a contract with the folks who run the Cuthbert, and it's been quite an ordeal over the last couple of years to get that to success with the issues around parking. And we have an agreement that that area is ADA parking during events at the Cuthbert. So obviously we have to maintain that availability, and so I don't know how we will move people out in advance of the events that'll take place at the Cuthbert, where we'll obviously need to let people park there because we have an agreement with another organization. So not understanding how that'll all work, I don't know that I can support it at this time.
George Brown.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, yes, Councilor Pryor pointed out problems. This whole plan that we had is going south right now. And Councilor Pryor mentioned that the operator of rest stop number 2, the plan currently is to have we have Opportunity Village and rest stop number 1 are already set up. The plan is to do number 2 and number 3 at the same location on Northwest Expressway, and then set up number 4 between Autzen and the Science Factory. The problem is the people who are going to manage rest stop number 2 have told us that they will not do so if rest stop number 3 is established there. Not only will they not manage rest stop number 3, they won't manage rest stop number 2. So effectively, if we go ahead with this plan and limit, rest stop number 4 to 15 people, rest stop number 2 and rest stop number 3 will not open. And we will have to find somebody else that likes that plan and is willing to oversee them and operate them, because community-supported shelters will not do so if that moves ahead. So now we lack, that's 30 spaces. Now we lack those 30 spaces. No one's gonna run it, or no one has come forward yet. Maybe there's another operator, I don't know, who's willing to do so. I'm not aware of anyone who is. And I believe that the people that have made a proposal to oversee number 4 would not do so unless all of the people from Whoville are accommodated, which is roughly 30 people. So I would say, yes, let's do number 4, but let's, instead of 15 people, let's make that 30 people. Let's just face the reality. And we may have to delay the effective shutdown date of April 1st for Whoville to make sure we can do all this in a timely and orderly fashion. And so I just feel like we are not doing what we said we would do, place everybody that's there before April 1st to allow for an orderly shutdown of Whoville. Because what's going to happen if this scenario plays out, we'll be basically back to status quo ante. And we'll have all these people being downtown again with no place to stay, frequent police visits, unpaid for visits to the emergency room and Johnson unit, and we'll just be we'll be moving several squares backwards, and we won't move anything forward. So I'm going to let other people speak. I want to make an amendment to Councilor Pryor's motion.
George Polling.
Thank you. I'm not going to be able to support the motion. First of all, I think that we should have included in the conversation the science factory, either the executive director and/or its board. I received an email from their executive director asking a number of questions that, frankly, I don't have the answers to, and that should have been part of the process. We've already changed the process about as many times as a chameleon changes colors. We started out with a goal of 2 rest stops and a certain closing date. I was okay with exchanging changing the sunset date because of the fact that the second rest stop hasn't been started. And, now we're changing it so many different times, people are losing track of what our original intent was. We talked about not doing what we said we were going to do. We're as far from that as we were when we started. So I can't support this unless we postpone the vote until such time we can get some input and feedback from not only the science factory but also the Cuthbert folks.
Alan?
So actually, I think adaptation and changing the way we're doing it is a good thing. This is a pilot, and we're trying to figure out what and how to do this. So moving it and changing it as we go forward, I think it is showing that we're responsive to the realities of what the circumstances are. So I think changing it on as we go along to make it work actually is something I favor. I had 2 questions. One, and maybe Chris, you can answer this. I saw the Science Factory email too, so I'm wondering impact on the Science Factory. And 2, there's also a car camping site near there with some folks there, and impact on that, because I've heard from other folks that not necessarily a good idea to put this near that.
Answer that.
Yeah, and I don't have, completely fully researched answers. And part of the challenge here, which I will acknowledge, is I don't have every single answer yet. But I think if we get this in place, we would work the rest of it out over the course of the next couple weeks. The current car camp would stay where it is and would be there. This would be probably not, intermixed on the pavement, but would be in the area right next to it. We had talked about fencing off an area where those tents would be, so they wouldn't actually be in the physical asphalt. So that would not interfere with people who wanted to park. There would be a fenced-off area where we could put the tents. With regard to impact on the Science Factory, it would not be impacting their parking lot, so their parking lot would still be there. I think concerns about children in proximity to homeless people that's a difficult conversation to have, because you get into the area of does just children in the proximity of homeless people create a dangerous situation? Some folks say it does, some it doesn't. That's why I put in the part about the operating agreements. Some of the rest camp operating agreements are that people have to leave during the day or they're not there, so that the opportunity to have interaction with children could be significantly reduced. It could be a rest stop where people are only there at night. There's a number of things you could do to resolve that. I don't have all those answers worked out yet, but I think those could be worked out if that was the intent that we wanted to do. This is not perfect. I'm not pretending that it's perfect. It's just an effort to try to get some intermediate solution in place.
Yeah, I think the rules of the rest stops also require participants to not be doing drugs, not to be doing alcohol, and to not have weapons.
And the sites are supervised, so it's not a free-for-all. They're supervised sites.
And my guess is all of them are going to have a fence around them, so that they're more secure for the people in them as well as people external trying to get in. So as to increasing it to 30, one of the reasons the Northwest Expressway site doesn't work is because the person who was going to do that site there says 2 next to each other don't work, which is 30 people. So I guess, George, when it comes down to you, try to convince me why this essentially is different than that and why it would work. 30 might be the right number as we walk through these pilots. In the end, it might be the right number, but for right now, I'm kind of sticking at 15.
Yes, before we go in.
One more question.
Yes.
So just to be clear, so we'll have the OVE site, which has been operating the longest and has 30 people at it. Then there's the rest stop. That was rest stop number 1, which is kitty corner to that on Roosevelt. The second one would be at the Northwest Expressway, and then this would be a proposed third one.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I just make a couple comments. I think we have been learning and dealing with need and trying to understand a changing playing field and improving our response. So I think that's what we should be doing. And I also think from all the reports of people who have visited, the first rest stop seems to be very successful. It's just, but it's been in there a very short time, so we don't have enough time to really know what kind of changes will need to happen over time. But so far, they look pretty good. So I just want people to know that. And with that, I'm going to go to round 2. George Brown.
Thanks, Mayor. Well, Alan, in response to your statement, there's, 30 people at Opportunity Village right now? There haven't been any problems there. They've had tremendous support from the community. It's fenced off, it's secure. They have a security person at the gate always, and if anyone walks in there that's not a resident, they want to know what your business is. And actually, all the tent cities are run that way. All the ones that I've been to in Portland and Seattle, and just reading on the internet, they all pretty much function that way. They have site control, and they can determine who goes in and who goes out. They do it in a very friendly way, but they want to know your business when you walk in. So, we already have one basically that's 30 people, no problems. I also like to point out that at that same spot that we're discussing now, in the 80s, there was a homeless camp there. It ran for a little over a year. We kind of reviewed that a couple of years ago at council level, and I pulled out all the old reports. It ran really well. There wasn't, it was well run, and it helped address a very serious need. So, we can limit it to 15, but if we don't have number 2 and number 3, which it looks like that's where we're headed, because you don't. Pardon me?
Still have 2. Still got 2.
We'll get 2. If you don't put number 3.
Yeah, we'll have right.
Oh, yeah, 1.
But anyway, we're still about 15 to 20 people short. So
Actually, 1,670 people short.
Well, what we're trying to do is to keep this situation stable for the people that are there and not move backwards. And if we go this route, I just see us going backwards, and it's going to be a lot more expensive for the city to deal with the consequences if we go that route. We already know there's going to be police visits. People will be going to jail. Their gear will have to be stored. Police are going to have to move their gear all around and hold on to it for a certain number of days before they dispose of it. And like I said before, there'll be more visits to the Johnson unit, and there'll be a lot more emergency room visits. So I think we have to, and situations are fluid, and they do evolve, and it's okay that just happens anyway, and it's all right for us to adapt to them as they evolve, just to prevent them from getting worse. So I'm going to wait for some more comments, and I'll make my motion.
Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. I remembered in reviewing now an email that I got, and I think all of us got, from the folks at Kesey Enterprises with whom we have the agreement to run the Cuthbert. And one of the things that they remind us of in this email is that by both agreement and administrative order, we've given them control of the grounds around both the parking lot and the surrounding area for the sake of security during the events. So I guess during all the Cuthbert events this summer, and then there's the other events for which people will use the park. Having run that a couple of times with the Freedom Festival, I remember that, and the Maud Kearns folks. So I guess I'm asking the manager, will you be closing then the camping opportunity during the times when we've already made an agreement to cede control of that area to someone else?
I haven't seen that agreement lately, so I don't know the specifics of it. Obviously, if we have existing agreements, we would endeavor to uphold our existing agreements and have this work in concert with that. So, yes, we would be.
So we would
operating
be-
it in the tent, in conjunction with whatever agreements we currently have.
So we'd close down the,
I don't know what's
Stop during that
required.
time?
I don't know what's required in the agreement, so.
I did take a quick look at those agreements. I got them late this afternoon. My review of the agreements is that they do not cede control of the asphalt parking lot to Kesey during Cuthbert events. It gives them the ability to use it, but it's not exclusive control, or it's not exclusive possession as it, like Cuthbert, they have the exclusive right to use it during the time of the event.
interesting.
The parking lot is different language. There's the amendment that they provided, which talks about the parking on grass that is east and I think it's southwest of the Science Factory, but again, that's different than the asphalt area. That's the parking lot itself.
And the only reason I ask that too is because in, I don't know, 2000, 2001, with the Active 2030 Club working with Maud Kearns, we do the 4th of July events. And when I chaired those, one of the things that we did was put fencing around the complete area of the park so that we would have perimeter control to be able to, to hold an event that made sense there. So are we not doing that when we rent out the park to people as well?
I'm not sure how that piece works. All I'm saying is that with respect to our legal obligations, if the council passes this motion, the rest stop could remain, and again, this is based on a quick review this afternoon of those agreements, but I believe that the rest stop could remain. That doesn't mean it needs to. The operational agreements certainly provide us the ability to figure out how to make that work, and my understanding is that the contract for Cuthbert begins, their season begins in May, and so we have more than 6 weeks to figure out how to make that work.
Thank you, sir. I'm tempted to want to table this, but I don't think I have the votes to do it, so I won't, until we have better information to make a decision. But I would say that it's taken us a number of years and an awful lot of hard work by the folks at Kesey to get the Cuthbert profitable and a workable venue again that people enjoy, and I'd hate to see us do something that would motivate them not to want to work with us anymore, and I think this has the possibility for that. Thank you.
All right, so George, if you're going to make a motion, now's the time.
Yes, okay, thank you, Mayor. Basically, I like Chris's motion except for the 15 individuals, so I want to change that to 30 in addition to those currently at the car camp. Should I read the whole thing, or do we all have a memory of what? Yeah, okay. That is my motion.
Is there a second?
I didn't hear the motion. This is Betty.
I better read it then, because you probably don't have a copy of this.
No, I don't.
All right, this is working off of Councilor Pryor's amended motion. I move to approve a rest stop under the city's rest stop ordinance at the approximate location of the existing car camp on city-owned land near Autzen Stadium. The rest stop shall be limited to no more than 30 individuals, including those currently at the car camp. In addition to those currently at the car camp. First preference for the rest of the 15 spots, 30 spots, shall be people who are now sleeping at the Broadway Hilliard site who have physical disabilities or a mental illness. The rest stop operating agreements will include provisions to ensure minimum disruptions to the surrounding facilities and events. So basically, it's changing it from 15 people to 30 people.
Okay, got it.
Is there a second? I don't think there's a second, so we're back to the main motion. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please indicate. 1.
Aye.
Betty?
No.
You're no. Greg?
Aye.
That's 3 ayes, 4 ayes, and an opposition. 2 noes, it passes.
3.
No.
Betty was in
Oh,
there.
Betty,
no.
3.
3.
Okay, 3 to 4, right? Yes.
4 to 3.
4 to 3, right. Passes. All right. Yes.
Can I make a comment?
Yes.
Wait, was that the amendment we were voting on?
No.
Oh.
Oh.
No, that was
I just wanted to make sure.
That's
Yeah.
my
The amendment didn't get a
understanding.
second.
We were voting on the original motion
Right.
that Chris made
Correct.
15.
Correct.
All right,
Right.
that's, just want to
That's
make sure.
correct.
Well, I just want to make a comment. I supported that because it's better than nothing, but I really think that we're setting ourselves up for some disruptions here, and I think we really ought to postpone the effective closing date of Whoville from April 1st, because that's only 21 days, and I don't think we can get all this stuff figured out in 21 days. If we can, that's great. But, you know, we're not going to be back from our break till, when, the 9th of our first so it's scheduled to be closed down before we meet again. And I'm just afraid if we don't get rest stop number 3 up, and we may not have rest stop number 2. So we're really not addressing the situation adequately, so I think I'd like to make another motion.
Go ahead.
I move to postpone the effective closing date of Whoville to June 1st.
Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Okay, then we'll vote on it. All those in favor, please indicate.
Can we discuss
Aye.
it a little bit?
Can if you want, but I thought you had already done so, George.
Well, no, I'm just saying, the way I see this headed is, there's so many things, and this will give us time to address some of Councilor Clark's concerns, perhaps, is just, we're not, I don't see us accounting for all of the current residents. And I'm saying that if we don't do that, and I don't know if we can do that before we meet again after our break, because we're going to be scattered around and we won't be able to provide the manager
So, Mayor, if I may speak, Best Buddy.
Yes,
with direction.
George.
So,
Oh, I thought he was through. I can't hear that well.
now, I mean, you know, if we can work it all out before that, that's great. But that would be, I'm convinced that we're going to need more time to work this out, work out a sensible, cost-effective solution for all this. And I just don't see it if it's guaranteed to close on the 1st of April. It's going to lead to just chaos and I think a lot of city expense.
Betty, go ahead.
Okay, I voted against the other motion because it's just changing from one temporary situation to another, and changing from one that's working to one that may not work. So I do support this motion, and I'm going to have to hang up pretty soon, but I hope this motion will pass to delay until we're back to think about it, think more seriously about what we should do, and we're all back from a break. Bye.
Councilor Colling.
Mayor?
Yes, Greg, you want in the queue?
Yes, I want to get in the queue.
After George Polling.
Okay.
Okay. I believe if we were to go back and review the meeting where we voted on extending the, or shutting down the illegal camping at Broadway and Hilliard, I tried to amend the motion to have it read to close it by April 1st, I believe. And it was, I don't even think it received a second. But anyway, the conversation was that the council's decision was not to close it by April 1st, but to start closing it by April 1st. So that means only who knows when it will be actually shut down. It could be April 2nd, it could be April 30th. We didn't give it any set timeline, which I think is a bad decision in itself, because you need to have some certainty on the decisions that you make. So I cannot support Councilor Brown's motion.
All right, Greg.
Yes, Mayor, thank you. You know, I'm kind of in the same boat here. I think that I would be able to only support Councilor Brown's motion if we had a time certain where this would be cut off. And I would say probably somewhere in the neighborhood of April 15th. That may give staff more time to be able to develop the optimal situation for relocating the other folks in Whoville to an appropriate spot that is going to work for everybody, for at least for a temporary amount of time, other than what we just passed for the Autzen Stadium or the Science Factory parking lot over there.
Thank you.
Is that a friendly amendment?
That's an amendment. I'm making that as an
I'll
amendment,
accept
April
that.
15th.
So Counselor Brown says he'll accept that as part of his motion, yes.
I need some clarification as to what this motion is doing. Right now, as George said, the existing motion that was passed was that you requested the city manager to start the closing of Whoville not later than April 1st. I'm not sure what this April 15th date is intended to do. If the purpose of this date is to request the manager not to begin shutting down Whoville until April 15th, then that just needs to be clarified. If this is an outside date by which the manager must shut down Whoville, then it would be good to clarify that, but that means the manager can start shutting down Whoville as the third site and the second site are up and running if he says, hey, we're ready to proceed. So I'm not sure what this motion is intended to do, and before you vote on it, I'd ask you to clarify that.
For the city attorney to clarify this, that for my intent of this is that April 15th is the absolute date when it has to be shut down by. Not in motion, not in anything, that we get a little more time to be able to adequately relocate folks, and that this ends on April 15th. That the Whoville site that is currently at Broadway at Hilliard will be closed by that time.
Well, that part I can't accept, so I guess I won't accept the amendment.
Not accepting your friendly
I'll
amendment.
second Greg's motion.
Greg, are you making a motion?
Is that a substitute motion?
I'm making that as a motion. That way that we have some sense of urgency, we can get this through, and then what we can do is move to a more reasonable solution, and that, for me, is for us to go back to the Human Services Commission and begin real discussions about providing adequate emergency shelter for these folks that are on the street.
So your motion has been moved and seconded.
That means there's two motions on the floor?
No, it's a substitute
Motion
motion.
to
Amendment.
amend.
I was going to
It's
say,
a
it's a
substitute.
substitute motion.
Yeah, it is.
Correct.
It is.
Yeah, the substitute motion.
And you want to speak to this, Councilor
Yes,
Clark?
ma'am. I'll vote in support of the substitute motion. The reason for me is, while I appreciate Chris trying to do what his conscience directs him will be helpful in the situation, and I appreciate people who want to do that for these folks, some of whom have it very hard. I'm interested in this body having direction over policy and how the city ought to deal with this issue from a larger perspective than just these folks. And when you look at it from the larger perspective, I think that Greg is right, and I've certainly said it before, that we ought to be doing a better job working effectively with HSC and with the county to address this issue for everybody that faces it, not just those who are illegally camping at this particular corner. I also think that I'd be much more inclined to be helpful if, we're kind of forgetting how we got here. These aren't folks who came to us and said, we need some help with the way the city's policy works, what can we do? These are folks who came in and said, we're going to camp here and we don't care whether you like it or not. And so jumping through this many hoops to try to please folks who've told me I'm going to do this whether you like it or not isn't really a strong motivation for me. I'd much rather think about this in the broader sense of what's the best policy for everybody in the city, and what should we be doing to more effectively address this problem for everybody. And I think that Greg's got it right. We should get past this and be looking to work better with folks at the county.
So Alan's in the queue, and I want to say we've taken up a half hour with this discussion thus far. I want to just say a couple things. One is that I think there are people starting to work on the long-term solutions, and I think that they would appreciate having the help of some of the counselors around this table to work on that. I think the reason that we have Whoville and the other rest stops and all the things we have is because people don't have a place to be. That is the reason. If they had a place to be, we could say go there, but we don't have that. And I also think that, what did I have here? I want to be sure that people understand that I don't think any of us thinks that no matter what we did, we could meet the needs of every single person who's unhoused in this community. So whatever we do, there will be some people that won't be accommodated. We have a bigger need than we have the means to meet those needs at this point. We're just doing the best we can. And at this point, you have the opportunity, it appears to me, you've got one rest stop, one that's coming on unless we do something that causes it not to come on, and the possibility of a third one. Those are all, for the people who need a place to be, those are all positive things that can be done to meet those needs unless we muck it up. Just say it. So, Al.
So with the 3 sites that we are doing, we'll have 30, 15, 15, and 15. That's 75. We only need 1,625 more. So it is kind of a drop in the bucket, but it's an important part. And I agree with what you said, Mayor, that the people are there because they don't have a place to go. These homeless people haven't just showed up. They've been here all the time. It's just that they've been hidden, and now they're visible, and people don't like seeing it. Having said all that, that's why we're doing these pilot programs, is to figure out what's the best way to do in an orderly fashion, starting small and moving them forward. So having said that, the Whoville site is an illegal campsite. It's not in the right spot. It's too many people. It doesn't comply with our rules that we set up for rest stops or even Opportunity Village. And I think it's endangering our pilots. So I have often said deadlines are a good thing. I was a little surprised I wasn't able to be here for the other meeting where we put that motion forward. I thought the deadline was March 31st. Instead, it was just no earlier than that, and it didn't give a deadline, which I thought was a mistake. So I like the notion of a deadline, and so I'll support the motion.
Okay, I think we're ready to vote. All those in yes?
Well, I really think that if we accept this amendment, I'm looking at this, and you know, the only thing that we know for sure is Opportunity Village and Rest Stop number 1. The other 3 are in flux. They're in question. It's questionable whether they'll open up at all because of the management situation. So to set a drop-dead date of April 15th is, I think it's almost guaranteeing chaos, and because people are going to go somewhere, all right? And if they can't go to these places that we're trying to set up for them, it's going to be just like it was before. They're going to be downtown. They're going to be in areas where they're not welcome, and some of them will be causing problems out on the street. There's going to be a lot more police visits. So I will definitely not support this amendment.
I think we're ready.
Mayor?
Yes, Greg.
One last comment for me. The purpose for me putting forward this deadline motion is twofold. One is to jumpstart the conversation at the HSC, and in terms of making sure that we have a plan in place so that we can have adequate emergency shelter for people. I think that we can do that. The second thing is that this also brings a sense of urgency to staff, which they are already working hard on this, but that we begin to really implement these next rest stops, get them up online and running. And I think that I disagree with Councilor Brown. I think that we can do this, and I think staff can do this by April 15th. And in any case, we will be back from spring break at that time. And if we need to modify or adjust something, we can do that then.
Okay, we're ready to vote on Greg's substitute motion. All those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in favor. In opposition? 1,
She said
2.
that.
Okay, so you've got a
Main motion is
main motion as amended on the table. All those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In opposition?
No.
2. It passes. So, the only comment I want to make to wrap this up, and then we'll move on to our main topics, is to say that I believe Eric has done a great job with the first rest stop. I think he's going to do the second rest stop, and I urge other folks to step up as quickly as possible to host the third rest stop, because that's the way it will get done in a timely manner. Yes.
My understanding is there's already 2 or 3 or 4 folks into that second rest stop that Eric has. His first rest stop is full. That's my understanding. And then I would just encourage counselors, if you get a chance, to go out and visit those rest stops.
Thank you for that. Okay.
Yes.
We'll move on now. Thank you, too, for joining us.
Okay, we'll see you when we get back.
All right.
All right, bye.
So our work session topic is climate recovery. Very timely today. My understanding is the U.S. Senate, with our 2 senators, are having an all-night conversation with the public about climate change tonight. So it's a very timely conversation for us to be having it here.
I'll turn over to Matt. All right, thank you. While it's getting set up, I'll just say thank you, Mayor, Councilors, City Manager, for the time to provide some background on your work session. My name is Matt McCrae. I'm the Climate and Energy Analyst for the city. My work involves supporting both city and community efforts to use less energy and to adapt to the impacts of climate change. I also help conduct assessments and create reports that measure progress towards our community goals. I'd like to acknowledge our Children's Trust, who proposed new language to consider in our climate policy and planning decisions, and a number of young people who requested the city take some time to revisit our climate action goals. While climate change presents us with an undeniable challenge, we find ourselves surrounded by others who agree overwhelmingly that we need to address climate change. Not only did this council act very swiftly in 2009 in support of the development of a climate action plan, but a recent survey in Eugene found that more than 75% of residents agreed that climate change is occurring because of human causes like burning fossil fuels, that climate change requires us to entirely rethink our behavior, and that climate change requires much stronger regulation of greenhouse gas emissions.
You might just hold this while you're going to look there. So
Sure. Thanks. I'm going to go really quickly through just a handful of slides to just to provide some background. So a quick overview of the existing Community Climate and Energy Action Plan, and then a couple of slides on our progress towards those goals. So in 2010, we developed the Climate and Energy Action Plan. It has 4 distinct goals: to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 10% below 1990 levels by 2020, to reduce fossil fuel use specifically 50% by 2030, to identify adaptations to climate change in recognition that there's climate change in the works that we can't stop at this point, and to identify adaptations to rising and volatile fossil fuel prices in recognition of the impacts that the depletion of global oil supplies will have on our community. Really briefly, the plan is organized into 6 chapters: building and energy, looking at the energy we use to heat our homes and to light our facilities, and as well as for industry; food and agriculture, looking at where we grow our food, where our food comes from, and the carbon impact of our food; land use and transportation, looks specifically at how we get around and how we use the land as far as buildings and businesses and homes. Importantly, if there's time to get to the scenario planning, that's the section you'll be talking about in the next agenda item. Consumption and waste, looking specifically at the energy that's embodied in the goods and food that we buy. Health and social services, looking really at climate adaptation. How do our health and social service systems adapt to the changes that are associated with climate change? And finally, urban natural resources, looking at our water quality, air quality, our urban forest, and other natural amenities in our urban area. It gives you a sense of the scope of the plan as it is. And just a quick reminder that this is not a plan for just the city organization. It's a community-wide plan. And it's not just looking at the things that need to be done by the City of Eugene, but looking at actions that need to be taken by a number of community partners. And this is just a short list. And above all, it's about collaboration to meet the goals that we're all trying to achieve. So last slide here, just an update on our community-wide energy trends. The top line there in blue is total natural gas use in Eugene. The red line is total gasoline and diesel use in Eugene. And these, the very end on the left side is 2000, the very right is 2013. And then the bottom line there are total electricity use in EWEB service territory, which is most of our area. And a couple of points to make on this slide. Obviously, those trends are headed in the right direction. They're headed downward. We're also, it's worth pointing out that these reductions began before 2008. So certainly some of these reductions are due to economic downturn, but not entirely. And then one other point to make, if we look at just the area between 2006 and 2012, there have been really substantial changes here. Total electricity use in that small area is down 11.5%. Total gasoline and diesel use is down 13%. Again, this is just in 6 years. Total natural gas use down in by 12.5%. It's worth noting that when we look at that gasoline and diesel use, that represents about $50 million that our community does not spend on gas and diesel. So when we look at how much we were spending in 2005 to how much we were spending in 2012, we're spending much less as a community on gasoline and diesel. And those dollars can be used for other things. It's also worth noting, finally, that this all has happened, these reductions have happened while our population has increased by 7.5%. It's really pretty remarkable, the per capita reductions that we're seeing here. One question might be, why then, if we're seeing pretty good reductions, why do we need to address our longer-term goals? Because it seems like we're on track, and we are. But like any reduction in use of something or a weight loss program, it's easier at the beginning to shed a few pounds, and the closer you get to your target, the more difficult it gets to make those reductions. And so the same is true here, that we are on track right now, but would expect that to become more difficult as the easy changes have been made. So that's all the background I have for you. I hope it's helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions as you jump into discussion.
Alan, do you want to talk about?
Yes, please. So we have at the very beginning of that, there were two unanimously adopted goals, the city facilities carbon neutral by 2020 and the 50% reduction in community-wide fossil fuel by 2030. And I too appreciate the resolution from Our Children's Trust. It was not my intention to adopt that resolution. My reasoning for putting it into the work session poll was to have it be an information piece for the work session poll. And as I stated in the work session poll, what I'm interested in is codifying our two goals that relate to climate change. And what does it mean to put a goal into ordinance? What if we don't comply? So what? What's the deal? What's the difference? So I handed out a motion here for discussion only tonight. I don't intend us to act on that. I want people to get a hit of the sense of it, of where this could head, my thoughts about it, and I've worked with staff on putting this forward, and Our Children's Trust also to put this together. So I'll read it. I move that the city manager schedule a public hearing for an ordinance codifying our unanimously adopted climate change goals that the city operations become climate neutral by 2020 and for reducing climate-wide fossil fuel use by 50% by 2030. To ensure we meet these goals, the ordinance staff shall prepare an update report every 2 years and a comprehensive report every 5 years beginning July 1st. By June 30th, 2014, staff shall conduct a numerical assessment of whether we are on a path to meet our goals. If not, by December 31st, 2014, end of the year, staff shall conduct a gap analysis of what programs and policies on our internal climate action plan, ICAP, and our community energy action plan did not occur. In addition, staff shall present to council options with a cost-benefit analysis for meeting the climate neutral goal of 2020 and ensuring we are on track to meet our fossil fuel goal by 2030. And then the other part of what we've accomplished so far is great, but what we didn't put into our goals was a community-wide fossil fuel reduction goal. So what I'm asking in this last part of the motion is to have staff bring back a community-wide greenhouse gas goal. And that says, staff shall also present to the council for its consideration and potential adoption a citywide science-based goal of greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2020, 2025, and 2030 for inclusion in this ordinance. The reductions shall be sufficient to put the citywide greenhouse gas emissions reduction rate on a path consistent with achieving 350 parts per million, or ppm, of carbon dioxide, CO2, in the atmosphere by 2100. So this basically takes the ordinance and says, let's put it takes the goals and puts them into ordinance, but it also has kind of a check-in. It says, okay, if we're not meeting this goal, then let's figure out why we're not meeting the goal, and let's put a plan to meet the goal. If we indeed have these as our adopted goals, let's put our own feet to the fire, and by doing this study by June 30th, if we are on the path, and if we're not, by the end of the year, a path to get us there. And then also periodic check-ins so we can keep monitoring that, because that wasn't included in the original stuff as well. And then finally, to kind of pull it all together, was that community-wide goal. We have the city facilities only goal for climate neutrality, but we don't have one for the community. So I'll put that out for conversation and open it up for discussion, because that's where I was thinking this was heading. So it's codifying it, but answering the question of, so what? What if we codify it? What does that mean?
I'm going to call on Chris and then Mike, but I wanted to, where did Glenn go? Not here.
What do you need?
Nothing that he needs to tell me today. I just wanted to put it on his list, so to speak, that I think it's important for us to have some kind of legal analysis and what if the language that we put in place to, if council chooses to do that, the impact that would, are there any legal implications that we need to be careful?
Yeah, we'll go through all that for sure.
Yeah. Chris?
Thank you. Actually, along similar lines, I had a really good meeting today with Julia and folks from the advocacy side on this, and I really appreciate Alan putting this forward, because I think it's really kind of a good conversation to have, and I really appreciate him saying let's talk about it before we make any specific motions, because I think that's helpful, because the advice I had, which was following along with yours, was if we're going to try to codify something, at least in terms of the city's operation, then it will be very important that the executive managers and the city manager and legal counsel within the city have had a chance to look at this and discuss what the implications and consequences might be. And they thought that was a fabulous idea, and that so one of the ideas was between now and whenever we bring this back up again, they would actively talk with the city manager, with legal counsel, and with the executive department heads and even staffs to say, if we were to do this, what would that look like? What would happen? What would be the implications? If it's vehicles, if it's transportation, if it's infrastructure, how does this translate? And what are the best ways to ensure that if there are any consequences, they can all be dealt with and addressed? We also talked about how it has really been the city's preference to work with the carrots instead of the sticks. And that from a community-wide standpoint, this is still very much an effort to try to stay with carrots and not to use sticks. And so not to become nervous that we're starting to create rules that are going to start going out and beating people and telling them they have to do certain things. But this is really, at this point, still an internal discussion and effort. But for me, the most important thing, and that which they agreed, was to use this time profitably to talk with people within the city to see if there were any unintended consequences that could be addressed before we bring this back up, so that we know what potentially would happen as a result of this.
Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. Can I have that slide again with the energy use through time? It's working. The goals that we set unanimously, as Alan mentioned, are working. I think that they were adopted unanimously and they're working because they're fine goals and they're widely accepted in the community. But I think when you get to this place where you begin to have a discussion around the 50% fossil fuel use community-wide and the issue of force, that's where people begin to have trouble. It's rather like the sick leave discussion. It's certainly where I begin to have trouble. I fall off of the capacity to support this at that point, because there's a very key difference for me between setting mutual consent goals that people will try to accomplish in a positive way and saying, we're going to force you how to live differently because we know better. And that's that for me is a prescription for an economic suicide pact, and I don't believe I'd like to sign on. And I'm sure a number of members of the community won't either. But to the extent that these are goals that we all have, that we all try to work together to accomplish in a positive way, I can be supportive.
So unless there's something about this that I don't understand, and I'm open to hearing about it, George, you're in the queue.
Right, thank you.
I would say that the intention of this is not force, and the intention of this is positive, to achieve this in a way that that the community will get behind and want to do. Is just want to put it in ordinance to keep us on the path and be able to measure and really see that we're getting where we want to go, as opposed to a broader sort of aspirational goal. So I just see it trying to put tools in place to check in with us and see how we're doing it, and say in ordinance form that we care so much about this, that we're really going to try to measure and see how we're doing and get to those goals. So that's how I look at it. George?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I think this is really good. This is a good plan here to do the numerical assessment and then do a gap analysis. That's all very sensible. And you know, presenting for our consideration the potential adoption of citywide goals, I think that's also wise. I'd like to learn more about that. Coercion is not necessarily a part of it. We haven't even seen those plans yet. We don't know what the components will be, and to not want to look at it is kind of foolish. It's a worldwide crisis. I would like to ask staff or request that, you know, when if this motion, after much more discussion in the future, passes, then I would like to see, you know, regarding the last component there, what other communities have done. And there may be some people that have already enacted some citywide things, not just the city organization, but community-wide. And so I'll Google around, too, and try to find stuff. But if staff could present things that they know about when that time comes, that would really be helpful. Thank you.
Alan?
So I'm absolutely fine with the legal review and community review. I was intending to do that, ask for that as well. In fact, welcome it. And that's why it goes as a public hearing for the community to weigh in on it. I thought it was important to go beyond just an aspirational goal. Right now, this is purely aspirational goal. It means nothing if we violate it, if we don't even come close to meeting it. And it's not intended to place hardship on anyone or set a prescriptive path or use force or coercion to get people to do the right thing and work off this specific line. That's not the intent here. The intent is to provide information and a path and suggestions of how the city organization as well as the community can meet these goals, and by doing these studies and this numerical analysis and presenting a plan to the council of how to get there. I think by 2020 it will be absolutely clear we should have been working on this for 5 years. So around 2015 I think is when we should be starting to act. Actually, we probably should have started to act a while ago. One of the things that I'm absolutely clear about, and I sit on the Oregon Global Warming Commission. We were just given the what's called the McKenzie curve, which is the graph of all the possible options that we can take to meet the 2020 goal for the state and what their costs are. Every single one of the measures to 2020 and well beyond that actually saved the state of Oregon money. they make us better off if we implement them. There's not an overall net societal cost to doing this. It actually is a net benefit to us from a financial perspective and an infrastructure perspective and a climate perspective and an environmental perspective for other reasons as well. So all those things I think are good things to do, and we can achieve those goals without coercion, force, and putting a bunch of costs on people. And then finally, I think I will point out that in our packet, we also received a letter from the Sustainability Commission that was put forth that supports putting our goals into ordinance, and they also call for a mechanism for enforcement and accountability within the council. And that's what this is intended to do.
Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. I, too, appreciate voluntary goals, and I know that a majority of the community support those and will work together to try and achieve them, and I think that's a good thing. My concern is while I hear the legislative intent that this doesn't include force from the mayor and from Alan, and I appreciate that, the devil's often in the details. And twice in this particular motion, you've used the words ensure in the first graph and in the second, that we create ordinance language to ensure we meet these goals. Now, I'm really not, I could use, I suppose, some advice on how one creates ordinance language to ensure something takes place without force, or what you would call that if you're not creating a law to ensure something happens.
Let me answer that.
Sure, go ahead.
So I use the word ensure. It's a word that is commonly used so that the plan ensures that we meet this goal. So that it has a group of actions, an action plan that shows the path towards getting there. It doesn't say that all of the actions shall be implemented regardless of cost. In fact, it says that staff shall present to council options with a cost-benefit analysis for meeting the climate neutrality goal. So, and the fossil fuel goal by 2030. So, and that is for the council to review should we not be on this. And it's up to the council to do what they will with that plan. My intent is to not have it be a bunch of sticks, but actually to be carrots. And like I said, I think most of the things that we can do to meet this, and we've shown you other graphs that Matt's created, some graphs that show that if we meet maybe you could speak to this, Matt, if we meet the fossil fuel goals for the city and for natural gas, gasoline, we will save a substantial amount, millions of dollars per year in savings, because we're doing things smarter, more efficient, more effectively. Can you talk a little bit about those goals? You don't have to have them, do you?
I don't have them with me, no, unfortunately. But yes, we've done some of that, so we can provide that to the council. Yeah, it is in the orders of millions of dollars, especially as you start to get cumulative savings over time. It's huge.
Mike?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Would it be fair then to say that an appropriate amendment to this or an appropriate change in the language would be, based on your intent, that what we want to do is measure better and appropriately incentivize those goals rather than create requirements?
I think we're not into the wordsmithing yet.
Well, I'm just looking for his intent, because that's what I'm questioning very, very clearly before we begin.
Well, if we have a city goal that the city facilities and city operations are supposed to meet this goal.
I was talking about the community-wide, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. I don't necessarily agree with that, with the citywide goal. If we're going to do it, we should hold our own feet to the fire. Otherwise, let's just get rid of the goal as a citywide goal. If it doesn't mean anything, that we don't meet it, then I think we should eliminate it.
So we will have...
In that case, I think we should have a plan that actually strives to meet the goal and does things that meet the goal in a cost-effective manner. And that's why it actually puts in the cost-benefit analysis in there. And I think we can meet our own goals and have it to be done very cost effectively. In fact, saves the city millions of dollars a year to do it. On the community-wide one, I'll think about that. I think that's not. I think that's the intent. We want to measure it and have a glide path towards getting there. And ideas. It has to be a little bit more specific than just measuring it and giving incentives. It has to actually be a little bit more specific. One of the common things that often hear is, yeah, but how? So this answers that question. It doesn't necessarily say, yeah, but how, and you will do this come heck or high water, no matter what. It actually is a cost-effectiveness threshold plan, too.
So I'm going to, did you want to speak?
Yeah, I did.
And then we're going to wrap it up because we had to have another half-hour break.
I can appreciate what you're saying with regard to the organization, because certainly we have to mean what we say, and we have to have the appropriate policies internally that match that. But when we get to the larger community, my concern, much like the other issue that we discussed the other day, and is that we offer people the opportunity to participate in something that is valued by perhaps even a majority or most in the community, but that we not put some people at a minority in a position to have to violate their own beliefs if that's the case. Even if we think their beliefs are wrong, I'm not comfortable with the position of saying you will comply or else with those that may have a fundamental disagreement. But I'm certainly in favor of us doing intelligent work to incentivize good goals. So to that degree, that as it applies to the wider community, I would support.
I just wanted to read the community attitudes about climate change. I think Eugenians get it. 77% of Eugene residents agreed that climate change is occurring because of human causes like burning fossil fuels. 71% agreed the long-term impacts of climate change will likely be catastrophic. 81% of respondents felt that climate change requires the community to entirely rethink its behavior. 81%. And 75% felt that climate change requires much stronger regulation of greenhouse gas emissions. I think Eugene's already there. I think we're catching up.
So
That's their beliefs, right?
That's the statistically valid survey of cities.
Now we're in the debate.
yeah, so I'm going to just say that in terms of this discussion, there seems to be a lot of interest, and it's in line with our stated goals as a council and the way that we're trying to move. And I would remind people that when you save fuel or energy, you save money for businesses, for the private sector as well as the public sector. So I just want to remind you, it's in the interest of our climate, but it's also in the interest of our bottom line to do this. And look forward to the future discussion. And I wouldn't want to end this discussion. I'm sure we'll have it several more. But I do want to say that I appreciate it being brought forward. And I also want to appreciate sort of the civic lesson that's been going on with this, where we have this group of young people and their supporters who have taken it upon themselves to try to work on their future in terms of that they have a planet they can live on as they become adults. And they've done a very important thing in civic discussion to bring this discussion to us, to ask us to step up as a council, to try to enable them to have a better future. And that's a very important participation in our society. And what you did is you brought it, and your counselors have picked it up, and we're working on it. So that's quite an accomplishment, and I just want to give you all credit for your civic responsibility as young people. Thank you so much. We're going to move on to the next item now.
And I'll make a motion to extend 10 minutes if we need a full half an hour. Okay.
We officially can go a few minutes over 7 because we used to go 7:10.
Yeah, I don't know. If you need it, I'll give it. If not,
We just keep on going.
I'll just turn over to Carolyn to get us going.
All right, Ian.
Hi there.
We'll talk about this as scenario planning.
Yes.
What is scenario planning?
I'm here to tell you. We're here to talk about Central Lane Scenario Planning Project. This is our first work session, so we're just providing a broad overview of the project and some of our initial findings. So we're all on the same page. We were required to do this work by the state legislature. Back in 2009, a House bill was passed that requires the Central Lane Metropolitan Policy Organization, that's comprised of Eugene, Springfield, Coburg, and parts of Lane County, to develop scenarios that show a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We are also required to cooperatively, with the other 3 jurisdictions, select a preferred scenario. We are not required to implement the scenario. That was not part of this current legislation. So a project management team comprised of senior staff from Eugene, Springfield, Lane County, Coburg, Lane Transit District, Lane Council of Governments, and the Oregon Department of Transportation are overseeing this work jointly. We have a project manager, Kristen Hull, who's with me here today. Kristen is from CH2 on Hill. She's very familiar with transportation planning in this region. She's worked on the Springfield Transportation System Plan Update and the current Eugene Transportation System Plan Update.
In the Beltline.
And Delta Highway. So a lot of good synergies there with our project manager. We have a technical advisory team composed of staff that's helping us understand some of the technical nuances and the modeling. This is a pretty technical exercise, I can tell you that. We also have a stakeholder and public involvement plan that was included in your packet, and we plan on making regular updates to you because you will be the decision makers in the end in helping to determine what that preferred scenario is. The Oregon Department of Transportation is paying for this project. There are sideboards on the work, and that we're not looking at all contributors of greenhouse gas emissions. We're just required to look at those from light vehicles. So we're not looking at buildings and energy consumption and that kind of thing. We're primarily looking at transportation and land use. And so from a long-range local planning perspective, this is really an opportunity for us to learn and understand what are the big factors in greenhouse gas production and what can we do from a transportation and land use perspective to have an impact on that. But because we are not required to implement it, it will really be a local decision whether or not we choose to make policy decisions based on what we've done. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kristen for our overview.
All right, so I will take it from here. So what is scenario planning? It's really about considering alternative futures. Plausible futures is a key part of that, and seeing what happens. And so in Lane County, we're really trying to do that to just see what outcomes our current policies might have, to evaluate alternative strategies and policies, and then to know what kinds of outcomes we would get from doing things differently. This is required by House Bill 2001, but as Carolyn said, we're not required to implement. We're required to go through the process and cooperatively select a preferred scenario with the jurisdictions in the region. I don't think we can say that often enough. Our goals are to develop scenarios that reduce greenhouse gases, consider economic development and vitality, consider public health, consider equity, and it can be tailored to each individual jurisdiction. And I think that last piece is very important because each jurisdiction in this region has a little different needs, and this process is set up to respect those. We do have some targets. The state had a target reduction of 20% for this region. You can see that the other MPOs in the state also have GHG reduction targets. This lines up with the state's goal of a 75% reduction over 1990 levels by 2050. And this is not a required target. We don't have to meet it, but we need to consider it during the process. You want to talk about the local Climate and Energy Action Plan goal?
Well, sure. Based on our previous discussion, we do have a local target, which is reducing it by 10% by 2020. This is slightly different from the goal or the target we have with the state, but they are very consistent with each other. They send us on the same trajectory.
So we have basically a kind of a three-step process. The first step of understanding what our existing policies do, deciding what our evaluation measures are going to be, what's our baseline for comparison. And that work is what we're here to talk about today. We're completed with that work and moving into phase 2, which is really testing and learning. So what are some alternatives we could look at, and how do they compare? How do they do at our different goals? And finally, in fall 2014, we'll start to get to the point where we are refining a preferred scenario and selecting something that all the elected officials in the region can agree to. So this cooperative selection process is a big deal for us. And this is just a quick graphic that gives you an idea of what this looks like. We have a TAC, as Carolyn mentioned. We also have a project management team that meets on a monthly basis. And then the decision makers are you and your peers at Springfield, Coburg, and Lane County. You'll notice the LTD Board of Directors is not a decision maker for this process. They will provide advice to you, and we'll have a chance to review the preferred scenario, and you'll know what they think about it. But because they're not a local government, per the legislation, they're not required to adopt. I guess the other really important thing to mention here is that public and stakeholder involvement will be occurring throughout this process, and we'll be kicking that off in April. So, existing policies. We looked at 2035, and we looked at 2035, we looked at current plans being implemented, and that means Envision Eugene. So we had to make some assumptions about what that might look like. We assume there'll be 64,000 more people in this region. So a lot of growth. And we are looking at your most current policy set. So in 2035, if we implement existing policies, we'd have taxes and fees related to driving that are mostly the same as they are today. We'd have similar participation in marketing and education programs like Eugene Smart Trips. We'd have West Eugene MX Open plus 4 additional lines of MX. We've also have an increasing level of transit service overall in the community. We'd have more miles traveled by bike than we see today. We'd see better average fuel economy for cars and trucks that are on the road. And we'd see more of us driving plug-in hybrids and electric vehicles. So this is really continuation of trends and things you might just kind of see happening already. So what happens to greenhouse gas emissions if we implement these current policies? And this is where this gets a little bit technical, so if I confuse you, let me know. When we think about this 20% reduction, we are required by the state to set aside those reductions that we get from fleet and fuel improvements. And you can imagine the fleet and fuel improvements help a lot with the state meeting the total greenhouse gas reduction goals. And so if we think about what we get from the current policies and fleet and fuel technology changes, that's what's shown with that big arrow. It gets us a long ways towards our goal. And that little green arrow is what we need to accomplish with scenario planning through local policy. And so the point of this slide is to tell you that we're expecting through things are going to happen outside of this region to see a lot of improvement. Existing policies that you've already put into place help us get a long ways there, but we've got this chunk of stuff we need to be really focused on during the scenario planning process. So we know that current local and regional policies would result in a 3% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions over the 2005 levels, and that's from light vehicles, and that's a per capita number. For point of comparison, if we looked out to 2035 and we held cycling constant at improvements in 2010, and we didn't have any transit in the region, we would see a 3% increase in per capita GHGs. So that 3% represents us heading in the right direction and stopping any increases in per capita emissions. So if we go ahead and do these things, we see that people drive slightly more than today, but they drive more efficient vehicles. We see congestion increasing, but that increasing congestion and the delay that comes with that matters less to greenhouse gas emissions because we'd be driving different kinds of cars that are much more fuel efficient. Cars that, like with a hybrid that'll shut off when you're waiting at a stoplight, so all of a sudden you're not emitting. So the issues change a little bit. Your vehicle operations costs decrease, but ownership and maintenance costs of vehicles increase, and that's partially because we're expecting to have more of these more expensive cars on the road. Biking increases significantly, and air quality improves. So as we look out beyond today's policies, we are testing a number of things, and this is just to really give you an idea of where we'll be heading next time I see you. We're looking at what can we do around community design, and this is things like more transit, active transportation, looking at how many people live in 20-minute neighborhoods kinds of communities. We're looking at pricing strategies, so this could be parking fees, it could be road usage charge sorts of fees, it could be increases in the gas tax, or other changes in things that affect driving costs. We could be looking at marketing incentive kinds of programs, so these are things like smart trips and employer commute reduction programs and eco-driving and other things that help to change behavior by incentives and letting people know about options. We could look at road expansions and ways to optimize the way our roads work. And we could look at things to encourage even more gains in fuel economy and the fleet mix than the state's considering as their baseline. So those are the kinds of things we'll look at from here. I did want to just touch on some of the evaluation criteria. One of the things that was very important to this region was to look beyond just greenhouse gas reductions, but also look at the economy, public health, and equity. So as our team sat down and looked at this, we have a few evaluation criteria that relate to economic development that we'll be looking at, and that's driving costs as a percentage of household income, average household income by housing type, so who can afford what types of housing and whether single family or multifamily, parking costs, and the value of time lost to congestion. On the health side, we'll be using a separate health evaluation tool late in the process that'll help us understand physical activity per capita, chronic illness, cost savings that you get from reduced disease burden, and change in accidents. And then finally, as we think about equity, which is very important, we met with a group of social service providers and equity advocates in the community to work this process out. And we'll be looking at several things across income levels, so driving cost across different income groups, so how does it affect people at different income levels in the community, household income by housing type again, and then per capita physical activity and how that differs for people in different income groups. And I know that seems like that's only one part of equity, and part of this process, because of the geography we're looking at and the fact that the process we're using is not one where we are creating physical improvements or kind of spatial improvements, we're not able to evaluate impacts across different ethnic and racial groups. It's part of the way the modeling works here. So with that, next steps is really to go back and start developing these alternative scenarios and then to test them, and you'll see us again when we have some of that work done. And our immediate next step is to hold our first community workshop for this process, and that'll be scheduled for sometime in late April.
And I'll just add to that, we're also making presentations to each of our boards and commissions over the next month, so they're involved, and then encouraging their participation in the public involvement process.
You opening up to questions now? Yes. So my question, I think you just helped me understand this. So how are you taking into consideration how many people are moved to use transit or, as opposed to their cars?
Yeah, so that's part of the evaluation process. One of our evaluation measures has to do with how many people are driving and what VMT is. And part of how we calculate vehicle miles traveled in the region is by taking out the people who are using transit. So we don't have a transit ridership number in our evaluation. If you, I know you got a copy of this memo. There's not a transit ridership number there because the tool doesn't spit one out. Okay. But that's how it factors in, as it affects how many miles are driven in the region. And we are also looking at revenue miles, so the number of bus miles are traveled in the region in terms of bus service.
Okay. The other question I had was about the demographic question, because we hear pretty constantly now that there are a lot of people who are making choices not to drive, and I don't know how that how many young people who are making different choices, how many older people at the same time are moving out of being drivers, and how that impacts those demographics impact this.
Yeah, and those demographics are reflected, the changing demographics we expect to see by 2035 are reflected in our analysis, but I think the point you make is a broader one and an important one for us to think about as we think about different policies we might implement and how they affect people who are making different choices about how they get around.
Because I think if we're using what we extrapolating from what we know in the broader, or we hear that is in the broader community, then we'd want to know how much we will lose or gain in the direction we're trying to go through the growth of several demographics, and then of course income demographic too. So and the need to use transit as a main source of transportation. Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. Kristen, thank you for the presentation. Claire and I have the privilege to work with her on the steering committee for the Beltline redesign too, and so we've had interaction over time. I've asked a number of questions about similar topics, and I'm going to hit you with one more that I haven't asked for a while. We had a conversation some time ago about ODOT's desire to kind of look at a more complex model for greenhouse gas calculation, or to begin the de-link of VMT as a direct measure for greenhouse gas because it's so inefficient as a measure of greenhouse gas production. Can you tell me more about what ODOT has done to make a more intelligent calculation for that?
Yeah, I can, and you've worked with me long enough to know that I'm not a modeler, but I can hopefully explain this to you. And so this Green Step model is a strategic assessment model that ODOT's developed particularly to answer the question you just raised. So how do you, in a sophisticated way, look at GHG from the transportation sector that's not just using VMT as a proxy, which is what we have done historically. We've said, oh, well, that's pretty good.
Right.
And so this actually takes into account miles diverted to bike. It takes into account commute reduction programs. It takes into account the emissions actually come from buses driving around to provide the transit service. So it does much more.
Kinds of cars?
What?
Kinds of cars?
Kinds of cars, the fleet mix, the kind of fuel we're looking at. Our process now assumes that 8% of the vehicles in 2035 without any changes would be plug-in hybrids or electric, and a quarter of that 8% would be electric vehicles. So we're starting to have a much more sophisticated understanding of what the future looks like based on the work that ODOT's been doing.
In the long run, I would think it's much wiser for us to look at the type of fleet mix than it would be VMT, personally, because, I mean, if I saw in the back of the room Mark Rabinowitz here a little while ago, if he's right, then we're all going to run out of gasoline very quickly. And the wisest thing for us to do is to develop as quickly as possible the capacity for people to drive individual vehicles powered by something else.
Mr. Fusion.
Yeah, exactly. Whether that's electricity or whatever it is, I firmly don't believe we'll see a reduction in individual modes of transportation. I think they'll just be powered by something else. In the short run, for me, I don't understand why we're not measuring, because I understand when you say when hybrids stop, they stop producing greenhouse gases. But when they slow down, they don't. They keep producing them. And so congestion, slowing everybody down in the distance that the car's still putting out just as much gas, is just for a longer period of time to get from A to B. So it seems to me that more important than vehicle miles traveled is congestion when we're trying to get greenhouse gases limited. Because we want people, especially to the degree that they're still driving gas-powered vehicles, to get as quickly as possible from point A to point B. The longer we slow them down, the more greenhouse gases are produced. So I'm wondering why doing something about ensuring the smallest congestion possible isn't one of our incentives and goals here in terms of roadway capacity.
I'll tell you what we know today, and these are certainly questions we can explore in alternative scenarios. But what we know from the work we've done to date is that when we reduce congestion levels, we see driving, actually the amount of driving goes up. And so this comes back to the can you build yourself out of congestion sort of question. And so the benefits you're describing are offset by increases in driving overall. That's
So
what
in
we
other
often
words,
don't
to the
do.
degree that we're forcing people out of their cars, it's working. They just may not be as happy about it.
They're choosing, Mike, they're choosing.
Well, if they, Mayor, forgive me, but if they were truly choosing when given the choice, they wouldn't choose otherwise, and that's exactly what she just said. Build them the capacity, and they'd rather do that. Isn't that what I'm hearing you say?
If you build it, they will drive.
If you build
Not
it, they'd
exactly.
rather drive. It'll fill up. If
Yeah.
if the capacity is built, it'll fill up, right?
Our current modeling shows that if we were to add to
So
our-
that shows a public preference, doesn't it?
I'm not sure I can extrapolate
thank
to there.
Mike can. Well done presentation, Kristen. Thank you. You clearly explained a very complex endeavor in a very straightforward and clear fashion. I've often said it, for this to mean anything, we need to make it real for people and not just policy wonks. And it's not just about reducing greenhouse gases. It's about lowering people's costs of transportation and lowering their commute times and less smog and better air quality and better quality of life. And those are the real metrics. And I think some of the metrics that you have get us looking at it from that perspective. I think they could use some work, but I think they're a good start in measuring how we can get there. And because we really want to see how much we move the dials by the different options that we have. And I'll note that all those options were incentives and policies and things like that don't force people to do things, but incentivize them to do that or move them in the right direction. And I think that that's starting to occur, and it's going to keep continuing to occur. And I think some of the policies that are embedded in this will help us look at that and how it impacts our community. If you just think about electric vehicles and what they were like 5 years ago or 10 years ago compared to what they are and how far we've come, or transit. I mean, let's look at transit and how far we've come on that and what the ridership is. I mean, MX has exceeded all 20-year expectations in the second year. And then in today's Register Guard, it said the highest transit ridership in nationally, highest ridership since 1958, I think it was. And that's by people choosing to do that. And I think what this really gets down to is what we talk about in transportation a lot, which is providing more choices. If they're efficient, effective, and easy to get at, people will choose them. And and by doing that, they also have these other impacts that we talk about: less cost, less time, more higher quality of life. And those are the things that actually make this more real. How many greenhouse gas reductions we get doesn't mean much to a couple hundred people, but the other things are really what matters.
I just wanted to reiterate what Alan's saying, because I think you're heading out to talk to people, and some people will resonate with your, reducing your emissions and your reducing your impact on global warming. We just had the conversation about climate change, and some people are going to resonate with that, but some people are going to resonate with how much savings they personally will receive from doing these things. And I think you have to have that dual conversation with people all the time. How will it better their personal lives? Not what we're making them do, which I heard here, but what we're giving them the ability to do that can save them money and give them cleaner air and make their lives, help them have a better life. So I think that's the kind of broader discussion that allows more people into that conversation and more people understanding that this isn't we're going to make you do better. It's that we all can do better and benefit from doing it. So,
Great.
thank you. I think we're done. Thank you very much.
Thank you.